So without further ado, thank you. We've got a lot of people here from Frozen Code Base in the Green Bay area and ITT. Thank you for coming the miles. We've got some folks here from Guild in Milwaukee. Thank you very much for coming as well. And thanks to everybody who normally comes in the Madison area, or the rest of you who came from wherever. You know, putting this together, the IGDA Madison chapter meetings continue to grow, and we're very pleased to see that. We're starting from this meeting on, we're going to have the slides up. For those of you who are at developers or at ITT or any of the local institutions, if you guys have announcements, please let us know, and we'll make sure they get included in the slides. We'll have some other changes and things that we're going to talk about later on. But I'm going to turn it over to Eric so he can introduce tonight's speakers who graciously have agreed to present themselves tonight. So,
yeah, that's great. Well, first of all, this meeting, if you don't know from my emails, marks the 1-year anniversary of our group. So we've been here for 1 year. Thanks. Many of you have been here to all the meetings. We meet about 4 times a year, and I'm just really flattered. This time we also have some great help. We have a group of volunteers. Noah over here on the camera, Jason, Patrick here, another Jason, which you can't see. But we've got a whole bunch of volunteers now, so we're going to try to post this on YouTube in parts, so people who couldn't make it will be able to view it. And we've got the website a little bit, and now that we've got a little bit of a workforce, hopefully we'll see some nice improvements there. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Filament Games here. We've got Mr. Dan and Mr. White, or Mr. Dan White.
Yeah, Norton and Dan White.
And Mr. Dan White. Norton, yes. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
2 of the partners. And I'll let you guys introduce yourselves and kind of what you've been doing in your presentation.
Okay. All right, let's see. Normal to looking around on the...
I'm both Mr. Dan and Mr. White. Actually, 3 of us here. While he's setting that up, I can give you a brief intro. As I said, we're Filament Games. We've been in Madison for about 2 years, maybe a little bit more, and we make educational games. You may feel free to leave now if that sounds totally boring to you. I won't be offended. Our tagline is, our unofficial tagline is that we try to make educational games that don't suck. But that's not on our website or anything.
Okay,
So
so
I made this slide too.
you made the slide, which is why we get the tier. You just sort of said who we are. And
Yeah,
what we
it's
do.
very basic.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess it's probably really good to open up with my remote working. There we go.
Excuse me. Would you guys be able to use the mic?
Yeah, we can try that.
You can take off the stand. See if that helps.
Is this going to work? Am I getting picked up? Maybe. Okay. So yeah, so we're not really here to represent ourselves as grizzled veterans of the game industry. We've been doing this for about 2 years. And my background is in interactive design, and Mr. White here came from an educational background in educational technology with a master's from UW. And we obviously have a passion for gaming, but we're not going to come up here and give everyone developers tips, because you know we're like I said, we've been doing this for 2 years, and we're always learning lots of new stuff as we go. So I just want to put that out there. I love that picture. So I guess sort of a brief survey. We're working on several projects right now, but really sort of the main one that's letting us sort of expand our company and move into some new digs and pick up more staff is, strangely enough, is based off of our first internal prototype for our company. Internal prototype is fancy talk for no one's paying us to do anything, so let's make something ourselves. So during our first year, when we focused mostly on consulting and small development things, we tried to conceptualize and develop a ocean science game that we thought could really speak a little bit more to scientific practice than just doing road experiments. And I guess I'll move forward here and let Mr. White sort of explain a little bit behind the model behind the game. And really those are the kinds of things I think that if we talk about today will be the things that we'll have to say that are interesting, sort of ideas of how we're trying to apply what makes games great into education. So I'll let Mr. White take it away.
Can you guys hear me in the back if I talk without the mic? Okay.
I think they want the mic for posterity.
Do you need it for the recording?
It helps for the recording, but if you feel more comfortable with it, that's fine.
You just switch back.
Go naturally.
Well, now I feel like I'm giving a real speech.
Okay, so Uncharted Depths is the tagline is the game of scientific literacy, and then we printed posters saying that for a presentation for the GLS conference, which everybody should go to this June or July, sometime around then. It's actually, we ended up calling it the game of scientific inquiry a little bit later, but we'd already printed our posters and they're rather expensive, so it's memorialized the game of scientific literacy. This is a game where you essentially play the role of a scientist in an underwater environment, researching aquatic ecology. The idea is that in this game you are using the scientific method in order to try to decode a system. And so in the game, players would come up with, so you saw the screenshot there before, which is what it actually looks like when you're playing the game, but then the processes that we'd like the player to get to do are start to make models of this space that we've created here, this ecosystem that we've created. In this case, it's a fictitious one. Now you can go back to the other one. So they sort of represent models. This one right here is what you're seeing is various different human impacts along with the routes that the different organisms take around this environment and where they go to mate and where they go to eat, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, the idea is that people, the student would come through this game and they would start representing their models in the same way that scientists do to make valid scientific arguments. So things like this.
So, with that being our first year internal prototype, after that year, I got married, and Mr. White, while the honeymoon, went out to Washington to sort of present our idea at a conference called the Serious Games Summit in Washington, D.C. And while there, he met with a gentleman from an organization called the Kauffman Foundation, and he informed us that oh my God, you have to meet this company called the Jason Project, which does really cool science curriculum for classrooms. And the Kauffman Foundation basically said, if you can work on an arrangement to work in partnership with Jason, we'll fund your development for this project. So that's where we are now. After that meeting like a year ago or so, we've sort of finally hammered out the details of that partnership and are signing papers and expanding our team to sort of pick up on our first full-scale 3D game experience. And we're very excited. So yeah, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, so this is kind of, if we have anything interesting to say, it's going to be about being small and scrappy and tight timeline and cheap budgets and educational to boot. That's what we've been doing, and interesting.
Was that me or you?
I think it's, I'm not sure. What is that? So yeah, so basically, as a company, like we sort of have a philosophical extension that I think in the realm of educational games makes us unique and I think interesting and useful. We're sort of extending our design philosophy extends out of sort of contemporary theory on games and learning that is vastly more appreciative of the things that games actually do really well. This book here by James G. and called What Video Games Have to Teach About Learning and Literacy, he actually presented a time or two ago, I think, briefly. Basically, Jim G. sort of puts it out there that every game, any good game, is actually in itself already an educational experience. And the act of actually enjoying yourself while playing a game is because you're learning something. And if you're playing a game where you're not intaking new information and figuring out how to synthesize and use it and expand your skills inside that system, you know, you're bored. And all those things are really actually learning. The weakness of the model is that generally commercial games focus and competitively on creating just those wheels for the satisfaction of themselves at all costs. Like they're going for fun. They want to make games that you want to play, and fun is the goal. So you learn a lot in commercial games, but what you learn in those games is rarely something you can transfer out somewhere else. If you took, what I learned in Warcraft is hard to apply anywhere else other than some sort of broad system transfers. Like them talking about, you could bring in a CEO based on their guild master skills, but those are the kind of things that are sort of bandied about as being like, oh, look at that interesting mapping. But we think that you can actually design games with that mapping in mind. Like we can actually filter out interesting systems and mastery and processes that are fun and interesting and engaging, and let you have them through a game experience and walk away with material that's really important and useful.
What's the name of that book?
What Video Games Have to Teach About Learning and Literacy by James.
You gonna read that?
Yeah.
I must be getting old.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yes, the book is great. That was the first Google image for thumbs up. That's that one. I thought that was easy. So, to sort of separate ourselves, using that philosophy, it sort of separates ourselves from a lot of the ways that we see a lot of educational games happening. I mean, we're not haters, and we definitely appreciate people who've gone through some of the same challenges as us, but we do think a lot of the time when people say, let's make an educational game, they say, well, what's fun? Well, jumping or shooting is pretty good. I've seen that, and I know the kids are into it. So why not, and then what's educational? Well, I know taking tests is educational. I remember doing that in school. So why not, make something where you shoot a test or jump on top of a quiz question, and that should be a great game that everyone will learn in. And I think that's a pitfall that a lot of educational games fall into, is that they don't take a pass. They take the thin veneer of what games look like they're great at doing, which is shininess and graphics and points, etc. And then they take another thin pass on what does learning and education mean, which is usually how do you pass a test or complete an essay. And by merging those two, really, I think, not very fair passes at both those concepts, you get pretty lousy games that don't actually teach you much. I'm of the opinion that often, for a lot of games that are educational, a pack of flashcards really beats the crap out of them. But that's not all of them. I definitely, like I said, we're not haters, and I think there have been really great educational games that have been made, and we've spent a lot of time thinking about what do they do right and how do they do it, and how can we recreate that. So instead of fun educational, we try and think about things like, how is this topic actually interesting? Like, what would actually connect someone to it? What would be challenging about getting good at this sort of thing? Like, how would you actually sort of engage and connect to that? And like, what would make that actually worthwhile to you to actually use this information in some type of context? What kind of identity can we give you that would make this information that we're trying to impart actually relevant? This one's for Mr. White. I got it.
This is the most fun part.
So, one of the things that we try to do with the games that we make is provide context to the things that we're trying to teach. Because one of the big reasons why people have a hard time learning things is because there's insufficient context around it. So, for example, if I hand you content, like this book that Henry's got here, like say it's a book about nuclear physics, without actually using that content in some sort of application, it lacks context. It's not grounded in anything you can actually wrap your head around. You can think of it like when you pick up a game manual before you've actually gotten to play the game. It's like, okay, here's a bunch of rules and abstraction, but it's not particularly interesting. It certainly doesn't stick in any frameworks that I have in my head already. So what we try to do for our gamers and Henry is build problem spaces in which that content becomes a tool. So essentially we build utility around that content. So Carmen Sandiego is a really good example, and I just use it because it's one that everybody knows and it's very simple, but the information that's presented in Carmen San Diego is all very much like the type of thing you'd see if you were given a flashcard quiz in an almanac. But what they do is they take all the information that's in the almanac and they provide a context in which it actually has some form of utility.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So this is another sort of topic that's been near and dear and very useful for us in terms of explaining games to people in the education field who aren't quite sure what we're talking about yet. Or even people who are very excited about games have difficulty with games versus simulations. So I think it would be sort of useful to impart the sort of same perspective we've been using as sort of how to articulate the difference for you guys. Basically, we sort of have a two-dimensional space that's divvied up into sort of two lines. One aspect that a game can be considered on is in terms of roles. And by role, I mean an identity that is given to you that is inside the constraints of that system. So you are somebody. You can only do certain things, and sometimes you're given a name, sometimes you're given a face, sometimes you're given a voice, or sometimes you're given none of those things. But identity is always something that games treat and consider how you relate and connect to a role inside that system. And the other axis on this graph is goals. So when you have something that's like a simple simulation, generally you build a system that has some dynamic variables that produces an output that's probably useful for something. When you're designing a game system, you have the opportunity not to have just information output as the main goal of your system, but you can create a system in which the feedback for the user is one of the main goals of that system itself. So you can design reward structures and mechanisms that propel someone through it. And that is something that I think that separates games from simulations. So with those two in mind, in the lower left-hand corner where we have absent goals and roles, we just have your simulations, which are like an engine running or something. Now, if you just slide over straight to the right and only add roles, you get what we're going to call simulators, like flight simulators, or a premier example. You are a pilot in a flight simulator. They don't give you anything else. Otherwise, it's entirely a simulation. There isn't a reward structure or something. They just put you behind that stick and tell you to fly it. And that's really fun. Especially pilots really enjoy flight simulators. They are, and so that's how you can sort of expand in just that one direction. And if you expand sort of straight up, go with goals but really minimize your identity, you wind up with sort of the sim game sort of genre, like SimCity and such, where you're given a perspective as a system manipulator, but with no real identity. You're just a floating, disembodied I that can see and understand all. But the system itself is still designed in such a way to reward you for interacting with it and have interesting outcomes. Will Wright had a great quote in which he's like, a lot of people make games where you're Luke Skywalker. I like to make games where you're George Lucas. And that's, I think, kind of sort of sums up that perspective of taking you outside of the system, but still rewarding you for playing with it. So when you have those two sort of things combined and you go in both directions, you get gamey games, where you have a rich combination of a system that rewards you along with an identity that helps shape your experience. I don't have to tell you guys, but obviously everything that's not in the lower left-hand corner is for sale at your local game store. So I'm definitely not trying to suggest that simulators and sim games aren't actually games, but it's just sort of this spectrum has really helped us sort of tinker with educational game concepts and sort of thinking about ways to change them and enrich them. You're like, well, we could really add some aspects of identity here, or the reward structure around a certain principle could really be, finer tuned, or even in some cases, there's really interesting ways to link identity and reward together, by actually offering good feedback on someone performing in the role that you'd like them to be. There we go. So another thing that Filament does is we steal. We steal whenever we can. Creativity is knowing how to hide your sources is one of my favorite quotes. It's from Albert Einstein. And I'm usually 50-50 on sometimes I say that he thought of it, sometimes I say I thought of it. So, we're not afraid of all saying like what are existing dialogue mechanisms, or what are existing ways to manipulate in 3D space. You know, so there's tons of game mechanics, both strictly mechanical and then higher interesting design that we are always looking to steal. I think anything that gives us an advantage over a lot of educational game companies that want to distance themselves from commercial games. Say, oh, we don't do that, but we do that. We want to do that as much as possible. It does sort of lead to when we're like, well, what if we don't need to do a dialogue system, but we need to think about how you can test different kinds of ocean environmental variables on fish inside tanks in space. And then, you know, sometimes we wind up paving into unexpected mechanical territory just because our own repertoire fails us for stealing first. But, you know, I think designing new mechanics around educational principles is one of the things that really gets me out of bed every morning, because we get some really weird things that we have to figure out how do we embody that inside a game, and then how do we make it something someone want to do. And for me, those are like the best questions we get. Those are super fun. I'd like to do sort of a quick survey. Obviously, as an educational game company, we think educational games are good at some things, but there are other people in educational games who feel like educational games should supplant books or teachers and similar things like it. And that's definitely not our stance. We think games are very good at particular things, and books are actually good at particular things too, and we should let different medias offer their different strengths. So games are really good for systems perspective, like we talked about. Every game's got that simulation, some kind of system inside it at the core. And if you're going to be good at a game, you're going to have an understanding of that system. You're going to take it apart and understand it and tweak it, and learn how to usually exploit it. And that's great. That's something that games do, and we want to, is a great way to have an educational game. Games are also great for creating sort of, instead of just work your way to the solution, you can consider systems that have a tinkerable space with an unknown particular outcome. You know, like there's multiple ways to solve a problem, or perhaps you even get to craft your own problem and solve that, if you like. You know, those are the kind of things that games can create that are unique and interesting, and can be applied directly to education. Obviously, games are really good at stuff that is visual and tactile, so anything that winds up in a space that can be looked at and handled and worked with starts becoming more and more gamey. We're working on a game design document now for an algebra course, and that was initially terrifying to us because algebra is numbers on a sheet, and it's hard to make those really get any traction. But once we realized that a lot of the algebra we're trying to handle can be expressed through graphs on space, we started picking up steam on how to make that game work. So as long as you can figure out a bridge into visual tactile strategies, you can start really talking about teaching what you want to be teaching. And finally, like I mentioned before, identities. You know, a lot of games tell you, you know, you're a superhuman face-shooting soldier, and everyone's like, okay. You know, and we've seen games that tell you you're a surgeon, and you say, okay. You know, and so we really think that getting people to enter identities that they may consider alien to them doesn't seem to be an obstacle for games. And you can ask people to do all kinds of things inside those roles that get them good at thinking in that way. So from us in our Chart Devs game, we're like, why not just tell someone they're a scientist, and then give them the practices of doing science into that identity, because they'll have already said okay. And then when you're done, you can say, well, you remember when you were thinking like a scientist, and it'll come back. So that's the strengths. Educational games are not so good at some other things, and they're worth mentioning. Probably the key, and I think I touched on this a little bit. I love Typing of the Dead, so I don't actually mean to slang on it, because it also wasn't intended to be an educational title. It was just, I think, a ludicrous experiment doing something interesting. So I definitely am not trying to put this game down, but games aren't good at sort of flat data sets where the information can't be organized in a structural or system way. It's really just about pounding through. You just get games can have those data sets, but that's not really what games are good at. Those usually come along for the ride, along with a better sort of systems understanding of how to apply that information. So I can assume some folks here could probably give a pretty detailed list of what creatures inhabit what areas in Azeroth. But you know, a deck of flashcards would have probably been better than what came out on /played for finding out that information. So I think that now I just want to play Happy with it. So this is a little bit more development of a thing that we found really useful. Are folks here using wikis for their game design documents? Can I get a raise a hand for folks who are already doing that? Are there folks who don't, who would like to hear about it? And maybe. Okay, so we use wikis for game design documents. We think it's awesome. Game design documents are hard to write and hard to maintain, but I think in our experience, hard actually means impossible unless you're using a wiki. Like a wiki, you can break down your game design document into small, extremely granular pages where you talk about one interface at a time, or one mechanic at a time, or one character, or one list of something, and constantly link back and reference all the other small, granular pages you created. That way when you realize that your Space Rustler is now going to, that's the algebra game we're doing, the Space Rustler now is going to have 2 modifiable variables in its equation instead of 1. You don't have to find and hunt down every time where you declared that that's how it works. You just go to the Rustler's page, update it, and you're all set. Because every other time the Rustler is involved in some other mechanic, it's simply linked to from that other wiki page. Oh, right. This is animated, I'm sorry. So you're making a related but separate components, and there they go. Wow, awesome. Each one of those would be a little page. And that's the other thing too, is that it's updatable, and most good wikis can offer reports and let everyone know what's changed and what's not. Obviously, this doesn't mean that the WikiGD is super easy. It still takes a lot of time, and it's still hard. But if you don't want your game design document to be irrelevant after your first month of development, and just have design happening inside everyone's head based on whether or not they were around for a particular conversation, as far as we know, this is the only way to do it. And here's that updated component. Okay, it's Mr. White's turn.
Outside the world of being invited to, they're not ready for the wiki. For a lot of our clients, we've had to put together game design documents as deliverables, and almost invariably it's like, oh, that's nice, I can print it out.
A good wiki can print out too, that's another thing. You can mail them or fax them to sheets, and they're like, ah, yes.
Now that your food coma is set in, I'm going to get to the most boring part of this presentation. Just talking about games in schools. Remember school? Yeah. And I have only 4 points, as you can see. They're all. This will advance as I go through, so you can see exactly how far you have left to go. We'll make it more bearable. So one of the things about designing for school is that, okay, so designing in general, you always have a usage scenario that you're anticipating. Well, it's the same thing when you're designing educational games, and particularly when you're talking about designing educational games for school, you essentially have to anticipate every usage scenario under the sun, because you don't know what's going to be going on in school. You don't know if it's going to be 5 kids sitting around a computer. You don't know if it's going to be 20 minutes because it's a 10-minute walk back and forth to the computer lab. You don't know if the teacher's going to dedicate an entire curriculum unit to it and play the game in bits and pieces over the course of a month or something. So what we have found to try to remedy that is to design our games to be as flexible as possible, because teachers always want control over what they do with your game. There's not too many teachers who are like, oh gosh, I have no idea what I'm doing. I just wish there was some technology that could do my job for me. And most of the time, they already have a very set way of doing things, and whatever you're introducing in order to try to help them do their job, it's typically got to be something that works with however they already do it, and everybody does it differently, so flexibility is really important. The other thing is just when you're targeting schools, you're always targeting dilapidated, outdated hardware. Not quite as bad as depicted here, but not too far off either. You can usually anticipate, a half a decade lag or so. It sounded like leg, I said lag, sorry. And essentially so you could view this as a bad thing. At Filament, we actually view it as kind of a positive thing in a challenge kind of way, because it forces us to focus on style and aesthetic over polygon counts and bump mapping and high-resolution textures. So it's a design challenge. Also, time is paramount. I won't harp on this, but teachers' time is always paramount. So whatever you give them has to be easy to use, and they're not interested in taking a lot of time to learn how to use your intervention. So standards is a big issue. I mean, it's a very political issue in this country, obviously, right now as well. But we decided that standards were kind of better as the devil that we knew, and that's also a position that we've revised somewhat. See, last point, you're there. Something that we've done some thinking about, because when you actually look at standards, they're not that bad. They're generally kind of broad, and truly they're written in such a way as to actually allow a decent amount of flexibility. The problem is how they're actually implemented. So how they're assessed, right? Because it always comes down to some kind of multiple choice test or some kind of standardized test. So basically it's reducing all the knowledge that's attempted to be represented by those standards to the lowest common denominator, which is a Scantron sheet. And it's very difficult when you're developing games for education because it's not a worthwhile pursuit to develop a game where your end goal is to get somebody to be better or something like that. So that's just a caveat. How many people were here for the wide load weight presentation a couple months back? Okay, so I'll mention this again. So basically, wide load is based in Chicago. They have a kind of a unique model in the industry where they expand, not exclusively, but almost through contractors. They have a core team of, I think, now 15 to 20 people. And then as they ramp up and down for projects, they bring people on as contractors. And one of the things that really helps them do is that essentially, there's probably a lot of you are familiar with the way game cycles work in the industry, is that you have periods where you only need a small team of people who are doing design, and then you might ramp way up while you're in full production, and then ramp back down again towards the end of the project. And the solution for most companies is to be like, okay, you're laid off. And that's something that we weren't too excited about when we decided to start a company. And so we've adopted the same model as wide load, and that we try to expand not exclusively, but principally through contractors. This project being, the project that we're starting right now being the largest one that we've ever done, we're in the throes of figuring out how this works. We've had further discussions with wide load since where they said, oh yeah, well, for the first project that we used this on, it was pretty tough. But now it's working great, so good luck into that second project. And that's kind of where we're at right now, and it's an exciting ride. So, okay. So this is a little slide on technology alignment. So going back to our roots as a company, before we even became a company, we were working on a mod called Decline. It's about Rome and stuff like that. But essentially, the key thing was that the big mistake that we made was that we used the Half-Life source engine. It's not to say the Half-Life source engine is bad, but it was bad for our needs. And so the moral of the story that we found was that technology alignment is something that's really important to think about. And what I mean by that is figure out what it is that your game needs to do, what the most important things are. And for us, it's education. So when you're talking about teaching people things, it all comes back to design. Design is always the most important thing. And then it always trumps graphics. And with game development, everything is always a trade-off. So if you decide to put a lot of thought and effort and resources into one particular area, you're always going to have to sacrifice something else. In this case, we spent a lot of time and effort and resources trying to figure out how to make a character's eyes look where they needed to look, and nothing to do with what we were trying to accomplish with the game or our pedagogical goals. And it was basically a waste of time and effort that could have been spent on things that actually taught people things about Rome. Well, the story is try to avoid the nuke and fly swatter. If I back up there, you'll see. Oh, that's too far back. Anyways, we use Torque for a lot of our 3D games, which is an engine that is built on the Tribes 2 game, which I think came around roughly about 2000 or somewhere around the turn of the millennium there. And essentially, it's good because it came out around the time that the computers that we're targeting right now were built. But it's also, being sort of an outdated technology allows us to focus on the things that are important. It doesn't have all the features that most game developers would want because it would make things shinier. But we find that it turns out that all those features, if they don't directly contribute to what you're trying to accomplish with your game, they just get in the way. Dropping the tow line, the title there speaks to an analogy of guy water skiing, falls over, still holding onto the rope. His skis have fallen off and he's getting dragged through the water. And that's how kind of it is for, I think, a small independent game developer, particularly one that focuses on education, and that in today's sort of climate of rapid graphics advancement, and this year it's 1 year it's bone mapping, next year it's normal mapping, et cetera, until the envelope is consistently and constantly pushed, and it's just not possible to keep up with it. At some point you have to decide that you're going to drop the tow line and figure out a better way to water ski. But this is, so this is what I like about presenting to you guys. So when I printed the GLS, I'd be like, okay, this is Far Cry, and excuse me, Crisis. No, Far Cry. Quiz. What is it?
I put money on Crisis.
Yes, and then DEF CON. So, two very different graphic styles. The moral of the story is that, we, like I said before, we try to think in terms of trying to figure out how we can get it stylized where we can't push polys and textures. Now, the difficult thing about that is that your clients always think that realism is so cool. Like, people who are not familiar with games for some reason seem to be infatuated with the idea that the pinnacle of the technology is to make it so that you can see my nostril hairs in high def. And it's something that it just takes some negotiations. It's something we're dealing with all the time. Particularly with this project right now, with the Jason project, they're a subsidiary of National Geographic, and coming from those roots, everything is very, if you're familiar with National Geographic, everything is photorealism is paramount. It has to look realer than real. So that's us. We're Filament Games. That's our website, which we're terrible about updating. And you can find some trailers there. You can read about, if you have an interest in any of the other projects. We have other projects going on right now. You can, I think, read about some of them in some form. But that's most of it. Questions?
Do you have any games you can briefly demo for us so you can actually see?
I can play you a trailer. All right.
It'll be the real test. These little speakers are actually going to work for us.
Okay.
We can put the microphone. Any other questions while he's setting that up? Yes, sir.
How many staff do you guys have currently?
So there's 3 co-founders. In the last couple of years, we picked up 3 programmers, and for this project, we're expanding to probably another. We'll probably pick up another 8 people or so. Okay.
Oh, wow. Did that work?
Yes.
Hey!
I have the power. Okay, yes. Continue.
I just wanted to know a little bit more about that, because anything that makes things more unified is always good.
I think one thing that I wanted to mention about it that I didn't is that, so whoever it is that's maintaining it, and it's going to take, someone's got to be dedicated to maintaining it daily, generally. That person is in charge of clubbing everyone. Whenever they're like, how does that work? And then that person has to hit the person with a club and say, look at the wiki. And if you go to the wiki and it's not there, then it's time to document it. And but ideally, they'll go to the document, the design document, they'll see it's there on the wiki, and then they'll have the answers they need to see how it works. So everyone, that maintainer's role is to make sure that everyone relies on that as the sole source for all of your design decisions. Because if you can start making a decision wherever you might be typing, it's ruined. So I think the enforcement of the wiki as the sole format for not only, when you think of it in the first place, but how it gets changed and evolves is a requirement to make it so that the wiki doesn't atrophy very quickly. I don't know, is there any particular part about it that you'd like to
I just had not heard of it, not really considered it. I find that with our game design documents, you've got the first one, and then the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. And like, I went to try to find an old screwdriver, their first game design document. There were like 10,000 of them. I have no idea
Right. And
what
that's,
to find, so that would definitely be something that would help us.
right, yeah, and as you version those, you'll think you'll find like, well, actually the screwing part is 2 documents back, and the jumping part is only 1 document back, and then it starts becoming problematic. There probably isn't just screwing in that game. Sorry.
We have a question. Which exact wiki are you using?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. We have been using PB Wikis, strangely enough. It's a free wiki online. You can get yourself a commercial account if you really want to feel fancy about your transfer domains. The thing that so far has made PB Wiki my only wiki I've wanted to use is that when you create a link in PB Wiki, it automatically gives you a list of every other page you've created. So it's really easy to make a new page that links back to 15 other pages before. So there's a lot of all other wikis I've found so far, you're like, was that page the Rustlers or the Rustlers? And was it camel cased? Or did I use quotes to make it not camel cased? And so if you don't have that list to quickly and painlessly wire up all your pages together in a really dense mesh, it's just a pain in the ass. So we've been using PB Wiki for that, really that purpose alone. I try and look at new wikis as they show up and putz with them, but that one interface element so far for me has been the deal breaker. We used Track for bug tracking that had a wiki plugin, but that actually had an implemented sort of hack to it to allow you to have images. Like we found the Track wiki was really awkward, and so that we walked away from that one. So that's what we're using.
A real question. You kind of touched on this maybe really briefly when you talked about standards and things with like dealing with what people expect games to look like. But I have some friends who have worked with education and nonprofits in general, and the experience is coming back with almost universally bad. That there are layers and layers of bureaucracy, layers and layers and layers of different people who have their idea of what it should be like. You know, everything from visual design to what it should be called, and oh my God, we can't call it this because that would be, culturally insensitive, et cetera, et cetera. How have you guys dealt with that? I mean, how have you sold anything? And you mentioned giving the teachers what they want, but you didn't touch on school boards and administrators and all these other things. So how do you sell to them?
We've never had any of those problems.
Oh, why not?
No, sorry. So one part is interesting. So when we working through our business plan, like we've worked with a few folks to do consulting to help us with that. And one of the things is like, oh, we need to identify a market. And really, when we thought about it, we're like, well, we want to have administrators pay for it, teachers to like it, and students to play it. So, like, in terms of just our market is actually sort of parts of 3 different people's brains, which is difficult for commercial launch. All the client stuff you described happens. There are people who have a difficult sense of vision. So, like, one of our main goals as a company, whenever we work with a client, is we try and figure out some type of bridging communicative document between us and the people who ostensibly know what it is we're supposed to be teaching. So the subject matter experts, we usually refer to them as. We work with them back and forth, slowly and painfully, to create a linking document so that we say, fill this out, and you will have given us what we need to know to make this game. Which usually involves a lot of back and forth, right? Like they don't understand how to create mechanics and actions and verbs around the body of knowledge that they are imparting, and we don't understand the details of that knowledge. So it requires that going back and forth. Another thing we found very useful is obviously in any dual company thing is finding your allies is really quick and easy, but finding the instructional designers on the other teams, if you're working with an instructional organization, those people can, we've found that as a profession, instructional designers are quicker to sort of pick up and link to the concepts we're laying out, and so they can be very useful allies when presenting. I don't know, we've hit a lot of other obstacles, but they all start sort of being very particular to the project, you know, like, that guy was just weird, or those guys were just jerks. I think those are probably the best general principles. Can you think of anything else?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, everybody in education is an extreme critic, because like you said, everybody has different ideas about how it's done. There's a lot of people who believe very strongly in traditional pedagogy, a lot of people very strongly in constructivist pedagogy, which is, you know, leaning more towards the idea that education should be hands-on and people should be a little bit more self-directed about their activities, as opposed to having somebody at the front of an audience like me telling them they should learn. So that's very difficult, because they haven't made up their minds about what's good yet. Just, you know, in the same way that in the commercial game industry, you don't really know good until you see it. It's also, I mean, definitely being an institution is extremely change-averse, even more so than the publishing industry and commercial game development. Part of it is just waiting for certain people to die. Part of it is, you know, new generation of teachers who are more tech-savvy and you know, grew up with the technology, or at least more familiar with it and less petrified of it. There's definitely there's huge battles to be won around the stigma associated with the games. The idea that we have to protect our children from them. It's a battle that we face constantly. I mean, it's 50-50. You know, half the people who I tell I make educational games, you know, some are like, hey, that's great. You're changing things. You're changing a broken system. You know, people. Like, isn't that an oxymoron?
Yeah, we got that one.
Yeah, that's verbatim. So it's a challenge. Yeah. That was one of the jokes.
That was one of the jokes.
Yes.
You mentioned a conference, just briefly at the beginning, a local conference, I think.
Oh, GLS.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. GLS stands for Games Learning Society. There's a research cohort at UW who Dan mentioned early on. They study specifically games and learning and doing some pretty cutting-edge research, and basically recognized in academia as being the people who are doing the cool stuff in this area right now. They host a conference every year. It's usually around June or July. It's called GLS. You get people from industry, you get people from academia, you get teachers, funders, just, you know, it runs the gamut. All sorts of people show up to hear talks kind of like this one.
Has it happened already, or is it coming up?
We're kind of right in between right now. It'll be, it's always in the summer pretty much. So the last one was in June or July, and the next one is definitely, it's confirmed, so we'll be happening. There's just no date yet.
Can we see your trailer?
Oh, wait.
You mentioned that you can have, that, you know, you want the administrators to pay for it, you want the teachers to like it. Is there any part of that where the kids playing it? I mean, is there any sort of study that you guys do, or any sort of data that shows that yes, the kids, you know, do enjoy playing it, but also that that they are maybe doing better on tests, or that it is healthy in their curriculum?
So Steve, president, says, "Is our children learning?" Yes, absolutely. You know, so the other 3 projects that we're working on or have worked on, that testing has always been handled by somebody else. One of the titles is a DS title, and it's being tested as we speak, and probably literally because it's in Hawaii, so it's about 4 hours behind us. It's still like, there's just not a lot of educational games out there, so the researchers in particular really, you know, they've tested with commercial games that are sort of educationally, like Civilization, things like that. But there's still not a lot of good examples of things where people have shown, okay, test scores went up by X amount. But yes, it is something that we usually try to plan into our development. I mean, testing obviously, but specifically testing to try to determine the efficacy of the product. Yeah.
I think this is sort of part of our the world-changing scheme is that we'd like to develop games that answer that base level of saying, oh yes, when you play this game, it turns out you do test better. But if we can succeed at that, I think eventually people will say, you know, since they're playing and succeeding at the game, and then yes, the test shows are still doing it, maybe we can actually use these games as the assessment themselves. And then we'll be able to sort of throw on the switch and say, there it is, games are way better than the multiple choice test. And we can really look at, try to embody way more useful ways of having learning in the classroom. That's kind of our...
They say the princess, they get an A.
Yeah. See, that's the thing, is like, what kind of test would... You could make a test after you played Super Mario Brothers, right? But what's the point? I mean, the real point is you saved the princess. You know, you succeeded. So even if you could draw a brief map of how to defeat Bowser, that's far less relevant. You know, that's just what's the word I'm looking for? Detritus. It's like the after effect of actually knowing the thing. You know, it's just the trivia that's attached to actual knowledge. And that's my crazy long-term goal, is to have games start directly as attacking the weaknesses of traditional assessment while still upholding standards.
I think we're going to stop with questions. All right, one more question.
Yeah, one more question. What age range do you typically target? I mean, you mentioned the administrators and teachers, but what age range for the students do you typically target?
Pretty much everything.
Not at once.
Yeah, not with a single game, but yeah, the DS game is for 4th graders. The algebra game would be for high school. We've got a Native American culture and heritage game that's middle schoolish, and this game will also be middle school. We made a prototype a couple of years back for a project management game. So I think we've hit them all. We haven't done any like ARP senior training. Who knows?
That's terrible. All right, I guess we're on.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
We'll go.
Don't do that. It's going to be terrible.
It's working.